Lake Powell has long been a destination for boaters and vacationers, but as water levels continue to fall, experts say the Colorado River system has reached an historic milestone.
When divers finally reached the bottom of Lake Powell, what they found at 600 feet would leave you speechless. Lake Powell was never supposed to shrink this fast. Formed in 1963 when the Glen Canyon Dam sealed off the Colorado River, it took nearly 2 decades just to fill, drowning entire canyon systems, ancient rock formations, and small settlements that never made it into any tourist brochure.
New projections by the federal government show Lake Powell may be headed towards dangerous levels within a year. The Bureau of Reclamation is warning that Lake Powell may stop producing power.
These are places that existed only in the memories of the people who had once lived and worked among them. Entire side canyons with names only known to the ranchers and river runners who once used them vanished under hundreds of feet of water without a second thought, treated as an acceptable cost of a project meant to power and irrigate the growing Southwest. By the early 1980s, it was the second largest reservoir in the country, a red rock playground for houseboats and bass fishermen, and for most of its life, that is all anyone thought it would ever be. Then came the drought that would not end. Snowpack in the Rockies kept falling short year after year, and by the middle of 2026, Lake Powell had dropped to its lowest level ever recorded, sitting at barely a quarter of its total capacity. The number stunned even the hydrologists who had been tracking the decline for 2 decades. Marinas that once floated in 60 feet of water were suddenly beached on dry mud, hundreds of yards from the shoreline. Boat ramps ended in nothing but cracked earth, and along the shrinking shoreline, canyon walls that had not seen sunlight since the Nixon administration slowly came back into view, inch by inch, week after week, all summer long. Most of what the drought exposed was exactly what people expected. Old tires, a scattering of sunken boats, some with license plates, still readable after decades underwater. Debris left behind by generations of careless tourists who never imagined the lake would ever shrink enough to give it back. Local news ran a few stories about it, treated it as a quirky footnote to a serious drought, and moved on to the next segment about hydropower shortages downstream. What nobody expected was the phone call that came into the Utah State University field station outside Page, Arizona, in the second week of July. A recreational diver named Aaron Voss, who had been mapping newly exposed canyon walls for a hobby geology blog he ran mostly for a small audience of fellow enthusiasts, radioed his dive partner topside and told her in a voice she later described as unnervingly calm that she needed to see something at 600 feet before he said anything to anyone else about it. Voss had found a side canyon that had been fully submerged for over 40 years. A canyon so narrow and so deep that even longtime houseboaters rarely bothered exploring it back when the water was high. A doorway roughly man-sized, cut with tool marks too clean and too deliberate to be natural erosion, leading into a chamber that extended back into the rock further than his dive light could reach. He didn't go inside. Something about the darkness beyond the entrance, he later told reporters, made him decide the responsible thing to do was surface first. He reported the coordinates to the Park Service, and within days, a small team of university researchers and National Park Service divers had assembled at the site to see for themselves. The first official dive down to the site, conducted under far more careful conditions than Voss's original solo excursion, took nearly 2 hours just to document the entrance from every angle before anyone attempted to go further inside. Park Service protocol for unexplained underwater features required exactly that kind of caution, partly for diver safety at 600 feet and partly because nobody wanted to risk damaging something that had clearly survived, undisturbed, since long before the lake existed. The lead diver on that first descent later described the moment his light swept across the doorway for the first time as the quietest 30 seconds of his entire career, nobody on the radio channel saying a word as the tool marks came into focus. Stick around, because what they found once they finally went inside that chamber is where this story stops being about a drought and starts being about something else entirely. The research team that formed around the discovery included Dr. Elena Marsh, a geologist from Northern Arizona University who had spent years studying the canyon. Systems that predate the reservoir, and Tom Redhawk, a hydrologist working with the Navajo Nation's Water Resources Office who had grown up hearing his grandmother's stories about the canyons long before the dam ever went in. Stories that mixed practical warnings about the river with older tribal knowledge he never fully understood until years later. Neither of them expected to find much. Sandstone carves easily under pressure, and erosion does strange things over millions of years, and both had seen plenty of formations over the years that looked artificial at first glance before turning out to be nothing more than wind and water working slowly on soft rock. But when the first dive team went in with proper lighting and equipment, the tool marks Voss had described turned out to be even more precise than his initial report suggested. They were straight lines, evenly spaced, cut at angles that no natural process produces. The kind of geometry that immediately told Marsh she was looking at something made by human hands. Inside the chamber, roughly 30 feet back from the entrance, the divers found a second surprise. The passage opened into a larger room, dry in the sense that it had clearly been carved before the reservoir ever existed, its walls covered in petroglyphs, unlike anything cataloged elsewhere in the canyon system, despite decades of survey work across the region. Spirals, layered one inside another in a pattern Marsh said she had never seen documented anywhere else in the Southwest. Long vertical lines that seemed to track something across the ceiling like a calendar, rising and falling in a rhythm that took the team weeks to even begin interpreting. And near the back wall, a series of handprints pressed into a section of rock that appeared, according to Marsh's early assessment, to have been deliberately smoothed and prepared before the prints were made, rather than simply pressed into naturally soft stone, the way most handprint panels in the region tend to be. Redhawk was the one who noticed what really unsettled the team. The spacing of the vertical lines on the ceiling matched almost exactly the seasonal water lines still visible on canyon walls elsewhere in the region. The kind that mark flood levels going back centuries before anyone built a dam or installed a single stream gauge. Whoever carved this chamber seemed to have been tracking the river's water level with a level of precision that modern hydrologists only achieved with satellite data and stream gauges, decades of careful, repeated observation compressed into a single wall of marks that Redhawk initially assumed had to be decorative before he actually sat down and measured the spacing against historical flood records himself. It raised an obvious question nobody on the team could immediately answer. Why would anyone, generations before modern instruments existed, need to track flood levels with that kind of exactness? And why hide the record inside a sealed chamber rather than somewhere more visible where later generations could actually reference it? The team kept the discovery quiet for almost 3 weeks while they brought in additional equipment, partly out of scientific caution and partly, Marsh admitted later, because something about the chamber made everyone involved reluctant to talk about it publicly before they understood what they were looking at. There was no single incident that explained the hesitation, she said. It was just a shared, unspoken sense among the divers and researchers that this was not a discovery to rush or to announce carelessly, a feeling many team members described independently in later interviews despite never having discussed it with each other at the time. That changed once photographs from the dive leaked onto a river guide's private social media account. And within days, the story had spread far beyond anything the small research team could control, picked up by regional news outlets, and then within a week by national ones, turning a quiet field survey into a story followed by people who had never given a second thought to Lake Powell's water level before that summer. Once the images went public, the National Park Service found itself fielding calls from historians, archaeologists, and a fair number of people with far less credible theories, everything from ancient aliens to lost civilizations, circulating within days across corners of the internet that specialize in exactly that kind of speculation, most of which the actual research team politely declined to engage with in any of their public statements. Local Navajo elders, when consulted by Redhawk through proper cultural channels, offered an account that had never been written down in any anthropological survey of the region. According to the story he was told, passed down orally through at least 3 generations he could trace, the canyon the chamber sits in had been considered a place to avoid long before the dam existed, not because of any specific danger, but because it was understood as a place where something had been sealed away deliberately, and where the river itself had once been asked through ceremony to keep it covered for good. Whether that account reflects an old and specific tradition or a story reshaped by decades of retelling is impossible to verify with certainty, but it added an unmistakable weight to what the divers had found, especially once new details from inside the chamber started coming out over the following months. Roughly 6 weeks into the investigation, a second team using ground-penetrating radar identified something the initial divers had missed entirely. The chamber didn't end where the handprint wall stood. Behind that wall, radar readings suggested a second, smaller cavity, sealed off completely and apparently never connected to the main chamber by any visible opening. A finding that took the survey team by surprise, since nothing about the outer chamber's layout had suggested a second room existed at all, until the equipment picked up the anomaly almost by accident during a routine scan. Whatever was inside that inner space had been placed there and then closed off, with the outer chamber built specifically to hide its existence rather than to serve as living space or storage, the way archaeologists initially assumed based on the layout of similar sites elsewhere in the canyon country. Marsh's team requested permission to core sample through a narrow section of the dividing wall, a request that took months to work through the appropriate tribal consultation and federal permitting process, since any excavation on culturally significant land required sign-off from Navajo Nation cultural preservation officers before a single drill could touch the rock. The process moved slower than the researchers would have liked, but nobody involved seriously pushed back against it, understanding that whatever waited behind that wall deserved to be approached with real care rather than scientific urgency. During that waiting period, water levels in the lake kept dropping. By late September, the chamber that had been underwater for over 40 years was sitting almost entirely exposed to open air for the first time since Lyndon Johnson was president, and researchers noted that the petroglyphs, having spent decades submerged in cold, mineral-rich water, were in dramatically better condition than any exposed rock art in the surrounding canyons, as though the reservoir had accidentally preserved something that erosion and sunlight would otherwise have worn away generations ago. Marsh compared it in one interview to finding a photograph that had somehow developed itself perfectly inside a sealed, lightless room for 40 straight years. An analogy she admitted still didn't quite capture how strange it felt standing in that chamber for the first time. Keep watching, because when the core sample finally came back, it raised more questions than anyone on the team was prepared to answer. The sample, when it finally came back from the lab in November, contained something nobody expected. Mixed into the sediment behind the sealed wall was a thin layer of ash, consistent with controlled burning rather than any natural fire, and beneath that layer, fragments of bone too degraded for immediate species identification. The bone fragments were sent for further analysis at a specialized lab, and while the full results are still pending as of this writing, preliminary radiocarbon estimates place the material at roughly 900 years old, well before European contact and centuries before any written record of the canyon existed at all. Marsh described the moment the preliminary dates came back as one of the strangest of her career, sitting in a small office at the field station reading numbers that suggested the chamber had been sealed almost 1,000 years before the dam that eventually buried it under 600 feet of water. Was ever conceived a coincidence of timing that struck her as far too strange to fully shake off even weeks later. That finding changed the tone of the investigation almost overnight. What had started as a curious side effect of a historic drought had become, in the space of a few months, one of the biggest archaeological discoveries anywhere on the Colorado Plateau. This was precisely because it had been hidden by 40 years of reservoir water rather than destroyed by it, a rare case of a dam actually protecting something instead of erasing it. Marsh has been careful in public statements to avoid over-interpreting the ash and bone findings until formal analysis is complete, noting that ceremonial burial practices among the ancestral Pueblo and cultures who once inhabited this region took many forms, some of which remain poorly understood even today by researchers working from limited surviving records. But she has also acknowledged in interviews since the discovery went public that the deliberate sealing of the inner chamber, combined with the precision of the flood markings and the unusual care taken in preparing the handprint wall, suggests this space held real meaning to the people who built it, meaning serious enough that they chose to hide it rather than simply abandon it when they eventually left the canyon behind for reasons nobody has yet been able to explain. For the Navajo Nation, whose historic and cultural ties to the region predate the reservoir by centuries, the discovery has reopened a conversation that construction of the dam itself never fully resolved. When Glen Canyon was flooded in the 1960s, entire sections of land with deep cultural and historical meaning disappeared underwater with barely any archaeological survey conducted beforehand. That still generates resentment among tribal historians who note that an entire chapter of the region's history was submerged before anyone had the chance to properly document it, treated at the time as an acceptable sacrifice for a hydroelectric project that promised power and water to a fast-growing Southwest, with almost no consultation given to the communities whose land and history sat directly in the flood zone. The chamber's reappearance, 40 years later, is being treated by tribal cultural officers not just as a scientific curiosity, but as an unexpected second chance to record something that was nearly lost for good. And there is active discussion, still ongoing among tribal council members, about whether the site should eventually be resealed once documentation is complete, out of respect for what the original builders clearly intended when they hid it in the first place. As for the lake itself, the drought shows no meaningful sign of easing. Water managers continue warning that Powell could approach what hydrologists call dead pool conditions within the next few years if snowpack levels don't recover, the point at which water can no longer pass through the dam at all, a scenario that would have seemed unthinkable to the engineers who designed the reservoir back in the 1950s and 1960s, when the Colorado River still ran high enough most years to make such a possibility feel like pure hypothetical. If that happens, more of the canyon will keep resurfacing, section by section, the same way this chamber did, exposing whatever else the water has been holding on to for the better part of half a century. Researchers on Marsh's team have already identified at least 2 other unexplained radar anomalies elsewhere along the shrinking shoreline that they have not yet had the funding or permission to investigate, both located in side canyons that, like the one where Voss made his discovery, sat completely untouched by human exploration. For the entire time, the reservoir kept them hidden, and both, according to preliminary readings, showing the same kind of geometric regularity that first told the team they were looking at something built rather than something natural. Whatever the eventual answers turn out to be about who built that chamber and why they went to such lengths to hide what was inside it, the researchers who spent months documenting it to the tribal officials now decide what happens next. The lake that swallowed Glen Canyon in the 1960s did more than drown a landscape and displace the ranchers and river runners who once called it home. It sealed something far older in, kept it untouched, and perfectly preserved for 4 decades, protected by cold water and darkness in a way that open air and sunlight never could have managed. And only a historic drought that nobody actually wanted was ever going to bring it back into the light. An accidental discovery born entirely out of environmental crisis, rather than any deliberate search. What do you think was really sealed inside that chamber, and why do you think it was hidden so carefully? Do you think the site should stay documented or be resealed the way some tribal officials want? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please make sure you like, share, and subscribe. Now click on the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.